Hi, good morning everyone. This video is going to be a continuation of the last two videos where we were talking about operations and signal receptions, and also this ties in with the message sequence numbering and how you can query the values of which order your operations or your message calls are and actually pull that into a table such as this. So this is interesting because there were some discussions we were having on the Discord server for systems engineering. Interestingly, someone was asking about the reply message and how you can actually simulate a reply for a synchronous message call, which is what you see here. So I want to start out by just giving the bottom line up front here and saying that the actual solution to this is by having a value property that you actually set equal to the operation call. So that really is the solution for this. And then what you can do to actually pass that value back to the original requester of the operation is by having another operation where it may have an input parameter, and then you set that input parameter equal to that same value. So that's the real solution for this. But there are some interesting things to be learned about this as well. So let me start by showing you how you would typically go about creating a synchronous call message. So you'll start by going from one lifeline to the next, and then you may have an operation such as this that says get a return, and if you notice it has an input value that is called string currently, which is a terrible name for this. So let's change this name to input, and that will be typed by a string. But then you notice we also have a return. So there are four different types of parameters that you can have for operations. Those are in out, or return. And in this case we have an input and a return. Now interestingly, you can only have one return parameter of an operation, where you can have as many output parameters or out parameters as you'd like. And there's some interesting discussions online about which is better, and as of this moment I think it would be good if you did research on your own about whether or not you'd prefer to have an out parameter or a return parameter, and they are handled slightly differently with simulations as well. So what you can do with an operation is actually drag that onto a message. So notice as of right now it says get a return. That's the name of the operation, and it shows the input and then equals. So right now it's not actually going to be passing anything unless there are some default values set. So if we look at this specification here or look down here, notice this is a synchronous call message. So as most people know, a synchronous call message will wait for that operation, and this is the activity that is the method of the operation. So if we look at quickly the specification, we notice this method is set to this activity that is called model, which is also a terrible name. What will happen is this operation will call this activity similar to a call operation action, because the activity is the method of the operation. And if you notice, it has an input and the return. So the return's not showing up in here, but what you can do is actually set that equal to a value property, and that value property can be of the domain, which is the one level higher than the user and the system. So that's somewhat what we're looking inside of right now, is the domain. And if we look at the block diagram for this, notice we have a domain block that is called domain, and it has a value property that says domain value, which is a string that has a default value of 2. And then if you notice, we have a user block that has a value property called user value, and a system block that is called system value for its value property. So what that means is when you look back at this, you can actually set the return value to be either that value property of the domain that's called domain value, or you can set it to a value property of this target object, which in this case is the system block. So that system block can have that value property called system value, and then you could also return that value to that value property, and it would be assigned to that value property. But then the question really is, well, how do we get that value back to the original requester, because that's the person or the entity that actually wanted to get the return or get that value in return. So what Cameo or what SysML and UML have is the reply message. So notice we have the option to do a reply message here, and what you can do is type in that value property name. So you could call this domain value, or you could call that system value. Now that actually doesn't do anything for the simulation, but it does give the reader of this sequence diagram the idea of what is happening here, which is we are requesting this operation to be performed by the system, and then the system will return or reply with that domain value. So that is great. However, there's some weird things that happen, and if you look in the containment tree, what you'll notice is there's this reply and it says domain value. In the simulation, that reply message does not actually do anything. What does do something is when you set that value property that you'd actually like to return it to equal to this operation, and then that actually does create a reply message. However, it's not displayed on the diagram. It will be displayed in the containment tree though. So let's look at this. So let's say domain value equals this operation. I want you to look over here at the containment tree when I hit enter here, and notice we now have this reply message that says domain value, and it's in parentheses. So if I were to open up the specification for this synchronous call message, what you notice is it has a reply message, and it's that reply message. If we look at this in the containment tree, it's actually that one that we just created, and it was created when we simply entered in domain value equals in front of the name of that operation call. So that's how you can actually assign that return to a value property, and then that value property will be available to the original requester of that operation in the simulation. So let's go ahead and do that. I'll delete this because that was for an example, but what you can then do is have a return to self or a message to self that will call the operation and take its input value and set that input value equal to the value that is now a runtime value of that domain or of that system or the target. So when we run this, what you'll notice is we start out with some default values. So we have nothing for the system value. That's not being used in this simulation currently. But we have the user, who has no runtime values, and the domain, which has that default value of 2. So when this runs, I'll slow this down a little bit so you can see what happens here. So my string was passed as an argument, and then my string is being passed back as an input, and then that shows up down here. So we will do that again, and I'll slow that down just a little bit more. So if you notice, my string is being passed, whereas it actually had a default value of 2. It's now my string because that's what we set in here. That is now being passed back to that original requester and then assigned as the value. So that is really how you can use replies, and it's a matter of setting your operation equal to a value that that original requester has access to, and in this case that will be a value of the domain, which is the higher level context, or that could be a value property of this target object. Thank you all for watching. Also, if you are in need of Cameo licenses, STC is an authorized reseller of licenses for Cameo, so we'd be happy to help you guys if you're in need of licenses for Cameo. We're happy to help if you need a team of MBSE experts. We have a team of over 80 MBSE experts that would be happy to help your organization with your MBSE needs.